This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Let's jump right in. Today's episode is another in the series of 20 Questions with a Believer. My guest today is Joel Berry. He is the host of the podcast called The Petty Prophet and the author of the blog of the same name. Both of these can be described as satire from the Christian and politically conservative perspective. In other words, the polar opposite from myself. Joel reached out to me after listening to the podcast, and I really appreciate Joel's willingness and bravery to come and talk with me. And in fact, at first I was a little skeptical. I thought, is this person trying to troll me? And Joel and I had about a 20 or 30 minute conversation where I realized, no, he honestly wants to hear my answers to some of his questions. So I invited Joel on for an honesty contest and a 20 question session. If you're a longtime listener of the podcast, you'll know that I often critique the debate culture in secular and specifically atheist communities, of which I am a member. And the reason I critique these is that debate is a zero-sum game. Debate is about winning. And what I'm much more interested in is having a conversation and getting underneath the pat answers and the typical responses. I attempt very strongly to get to that, to get underneath the conversation in this conversation with Joel. I think I succeed at times and fail at others, but I will let you be the judge of that. What you'll notice that we don't do, or I don't do specifically, is spend a lot of time wasted on that we disagree. That we disagree is a given. And again, as I said, politically, theologically, metaphysically, philosophically, we have grave differences from one another. When I say that as a given, I mean we don't waste the time debating each other on these topics. And instead, we try to focus on asking one another questions to actually understand the other. Again, I think we succeed in many places and we fail in others, but I think it makes for a compelling conversation. If by chance you have come to the Graceful Atheist Podcast from The Petty Prophet, welcome. I am very interested in talking to believers and even listening to critiques of my podcast or secular humanism or atheism. If you're interested in coming on the show and talking to me, as long as you're willing to have an honesty contest, get in touch with me at the email address gracefulatheist@gmail.com. Here's my conversation with Joel Berry. Joel, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on.
I appreciate you coming on. So, Joel, you have a podcast, and I think that you might describe it as satire from a conservative and a believer's point of view. Is that an accurate, fair assessment?
That is true. So what happened with me about 6 months or so ago, I left the corporate world, a job that I'd had for 10 years, suddenly faced with kind of, what do I want to do with my life? And I did not want to go back into the corporate world again. It was very soul crushing, I thought. And so I just started to think to myself, what if I just completely jumped tracks and did something else, something more creative? And I think that's more to my bent. And I'm a podcast-aholic. I love podcasts. I've always loved writing. And so I just thought, well, maybe I'll just do that. I don't really know what I'll write about and what I'll podcast about yet, but let's just start by writing and talking about things that I care about, things that I think about a lot. And that kind of developed into this thing called The Petty Prophet. So it's inspired by, if you're familiar with the Babylon Bee, it's kind of like a Christian Onion kind of a thing. Yeah. And it has some serious stuff in there, some op-ed. And I like to focus on the culture, on art, entertainment, philosophy, really just whatever's on my mind that day. And it's fun. I've never been poorer, but I've also never been happier. So I'm having a good time.
All right. Well, very good. So I want to acknowledge up front that, and we've talked about this off mic, that we are definitely coming from radically different perspectives,
Yeah.
both from a political point of view, from a philosophical point of view. But I'm really interested in where the touch points might be where we do agree or where we do have a shared set of values. And I'll just say up front, I think just from the little bit that I've gotten to know you, the little bit I've listened about you, I think we both care about people.
Mm-hmm.
I think we both care about the truth.
Yep.
I think we care about principles, even if we would probably disagree on what some of those principles are.
Right.
So from that kind of as a starting point, one of the things that I've learned is that with discussions between believers and non-believers in particular, they can come from two different sets of values, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a tendency to talk past one another.
Yes, different starting points.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's nearly impossible to rectify that. So what we're going to do today is a 20 question style. We're going to ask each other a question and we're going to give each other the space to answer those.
Yeah.
And we're not really trying to change the other person's mind, but rather to understand one another in a better way.
Absolutely. And if I may, I just, if I can just kind of tell the audience how I found you. I forget exactly how I found you on Twitter, but I somehow bumped into you. I do follow a few atheist people on Twitter and a lot of folks who came out of the like the fundamentalist kind of toxic brand of Christianity, which is something that I came out of. And I started listening to your podcast a few weeks ago, really found myself enjoying it. For one, I really appreciate your approach, and I think it's so unique. And you are defying that stereotype that people have of atheists as, kind of being the snarky, whatever that stereotype is.
Sure.
And I appreciate what seems to be like just this real, if I may, like shepherd's heart for people who are coming out of their faith, going through these deconversion experiences, to come alongside them and help them through what's a really difficult time in their lives. And I don't know, I thought that was really neat. I really connected with it, really enjoyed the stories of the people who have come on your podcast. And it's really challenged me. I mean, it forced me to think more about, why am I still a Christian? Because I share a lot of experiences with these people. I came out of what is known as the IFB, or Independent Fundamental Baptist movement, very strict kind of misogynistic form of Christianity, a lot of abuse in that world. And, it made me think, well, so why do some people deconvert and some people stay in the faith? And I liked I forget what her name is. You might have to refresh me. You talked with a lady who explained the different types of trauma, how people respond to abuse. There's abuse and there's trauma. Yeah. And people respond to abuse in different ways. And that really connected with me too, because I have siblings who I believe might be going through deconversion experiences as a result of the same thing that I experienced. So why are they deconverting and why am I not? So it really forced me to think long and hard about some of the deeper questions of, why do I believe? What exactly do I believe? And I think it's always good when you can be challenged like that. So I guess thank you for what you're putting out there. It's great content, and I've really, really enjoyed it.
Well, wow, I really appreciate that. I think the thing that I will say is that is intentional. When I did admit to myself that I no longer believed, one of the first things that you do is you go and look out into social media and online. You try to find resources and what other people think. And very often the major thing that you find is kind of what I call debate culture, right? It's very hostile, perspective. And that's interesting for a little while. I definitely have to admit that I went through an angry phase, and I think that's a part of this process. Yeah, I was angry. I was mean to a couple people, but shortly thereafter, I thought, well, there's got to be more than this, right? I haven't changed that dramatically. I still care about people, right? So what do I do now? Was really the question. So when I started to think about doing the podcast, I really wanted to approach it from that perspective of people who have had a life-defining faith, something that was non-trivial, right? We're not talking about the 12-year-old who says, I'm not going to church anymore. Yeah. We're talking about adults who spent the majority of their lives in a deep life-defining faith and then and then find that they can no longer believe. And that's a pretty dramatic thing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so thanks for engaging with me and with others the way you do. It's good stuff.
I appreciate it. So my first question to you is kind of off the same, the topic off the top there is about values. You had a guest on recently, I believe his name was John, who's a politician, and he talked about faith, family, and freedom. What can you articulate the values that you find most dear and maybe talk about those?
Oh man, that's good. I would have to say that my values they have to be the values of what Jesus said was the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, it really all comes down to love in one way or another. I think that no matter what you do in any sphere, whether it is in politics, whether it's in your family, in your work, if it's not being done with love and coming from a place of love for God and others, then it's empty. And so I think if I could sum it down to one thing, that would have to be it.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's hard.
Yeah. That was a non-trivial question.
Yeah. It's hard because being a father has shown me how incredibly selfish I can be. Being a husband has shown me how incredibly selfish I can be. So, unconditional love, not just in feeling, but in action, it's like a day-to-day challenge. It's like kind of the idea from scripture of dying to yourself every day. Like you gotta put yourself on the altar and live for others. It's kind of something you have to renew day to day. And I probably fail more often than I succeed, but hopefully getting better.
Well, I can sure relate to just, when I became a father is when I really understood how selfish I really
oh my
was.
gosh. Yeah.
But both marriage and fatherhood definitely
it brings it out. Really when it's 11:30 and your kid will not go to bed, and you just want to watch, the next episode of The Mandalorian,
Yeah. So I'll just mention briefly that for me, it's really close, right? Like there's just a hair's width difference between what we're describing. Maybe one of your questions was about why I use the term grace, but I'll say here.
Yeah.
Grace was such a deeply meaningful part of my Christianity. I had a theology professor I just adored him, right? He was my mentor. He was an intellectual giant. He was the most humble Christian that I had ever met. And he talked about grace on every level, from just being a humble and loving human being to the very intense systematic theology perspective. And I was just deeply influenced by that. And that was what brought me into Christianity as well. Jesus saying, I came for the sick and not the well.
Yeah.
That was deep. That was what called to me.
Yeah.
What I've come to understand is that the thing that is calling to me is about human to human grace, right? I believe that we all need to be loved and accepted by other human beings.
Absolutely.
Right? And that is maybe the most profound thing that a human can experience, is to be known as deeply as possible and loved. And all I'm saying is that is perfectly natural. That there,
like you don't need God in order to have
I don't need a spiritual dimension to have grace and love.
Would you say, kind of deconverting and leaving God behind has even amplified it for you, made it easier to have those human connections, centered around grace? Or I guess the other flip side of the other way to ask that would be, do you think that religion or Christianity can hinder that for a lot of people and for you?
Yes. When I want to be very clear here, I don't mean that I have any better ability to enact.
Right.
That
sure.
That love. But for sure, the thing that I experienced immediately was the freedom to embrace everyone. I don't know what your particular perspective is on the LGBT community, but I was in Bible college in the 90s, a very conservative Bible college, and I was doing things like Church on the Street. And I made good friends in the gay community, and they really challenged me about, if you say you love me, come to the Pride Parade, right? And at the time I was frozen. I was unable to do that.
Yeah.
And now my arms are just open, right? I have no feeling of restriction or the need to tell other people how they need to live their lives. Hello, this is Future David. As Joel can attest, I let each of my guests know before we begin recording that if they say something that didn't come out quite right, that I will gladly edit it for them. I want the best that people have to say and not gotchas. In this case, it was me putting my foot in my mouth. I'm going to leave the following statement in for integrity and honesty's sake. However, I didn't convey the idea well at all, and so I'm apologizing here. This was so egregiously inarticulate and did not convey what I actually meant that I am doing what I almost never do, which is to interrupt the natural flow of the conversation and provide more context. I was both trying to convey what I felt back in the 90s, the whole abhorrent, hate the sin, love the sinner concept. Ironically, what I was really trying to convey was my current ability to talk to people who I have significant differences with. That might include Joel. I really wish that I had not brought this up in the LGBTQ context. It makes it sound as if I am comparing that today or that I see it in the same light as I did back then. And just to be ultra clear here, I do not. One other thing I'll just add is that even as a Christian, I used to say this a lot. Acceptance is not condoning.
Right.
I can accept and love someone who is abhorrent to me, right? Who I completely diametrically disagree with.
Right.
But at the same time, again, it's just a freedom to accept people that I wouldn't otherwise. I do think that the religious context does limit that. Okay.
Yeah. So that actually plays really well into what my first question was, because listening to your podcast, you talk a lot about how one of the big moments for you was, delving into apologetics and realizing that you couldn't find any real hard evidence for the resurrection. And my first question was that the only thing, or was there more that played into that deconversion experience for you? And I guess maybe you already answered it. It seems like there was another thing at play there in terms of you felt the need to want to be able to embrace people more, especially in the LGBT community.
I wish I could say that's what it was. I wish I was that good a person.
Because I do feel like that the stories that I hear most often is the people that come on your podcast, usually it's a really ugly experience they've had with religion, of hypocrisy or just things that didn't make sense. Or for a lot of other people, it seems to be some sort of political element to it as well, like, progressive politics or, the LGBT community or things like that play into it somehow. And so I guess I was just wondering if there were any of those elements in your story.
No is the quick answer. And so there is a movement, I'm sure you're aware if you're on Twitter, the ex-evangelical movement.
Yeah.
That is very heavily influenced by the political climate that we're in. And again, we've already acknowledged that, we have probably some very foundational disagreements from a political perspective. I want to save that for another conversation.
Sure.
My deconversion did happen in 2015, but prior to the Trump announcing, let's say. And so it really was independent of that. And again, I would love to say that it was because of my desire to embrace the entire world, and that's not the case either. So I've written about this a lot. I've tried to describe this. This is maybe the hardest thing to describe. And I'll try to give you just a word picture. If you imagine Christianity as a beautiful cathedral, let's say, and underneath that cathedral are 3 or 4 pillars that the cathedral is balanced on. And it was the erosion of those pillars, the presuppositions, the assumptions underneath it, inside the bubble, inside Christianity, it is beautiful.
Yeah.
I would like to believe, right?
Yeah.
Jesus is amazing, right? But the truth claims are predicated on a number of things. And I've tried to talk about these, but dualism is the big one, right? That there is something other than nature.
Yeah.
It's a huge leap. That for me, two things happen simultaneously. The resurrection is the binary thing for me.
Oh yeah, it all centers on that, doesn't it? That's the central idea. Yep.
So I often will say that it was when I finally realized I didn't have any objective, and by objective I don't mean the Platonic sense. In fact, I'm arguing against the Platonic ideals, but rather an objective from a human perspective of that people would agree with each other. That I had no objective evidence for the resurrection. But simultaneous to that was reading about the soul. I think part of what is so hard for the believer is to be human, is to have this deep sense of self, of the I who is speaking and experiencing. And it's a very small step to say that I exists out, beyond my body, and that when I die, when this body dies, that the I continues on. This idea of the soul. And reading some very straightforward atheist blogs, Greta Christina specifically, and she was talking about how tied consciousness is to the physical body. If we take a medication, if we get hit with a hammer, if we stop breathing for a certain amount of time, the lights go out.
Or the way mental illness affects people too. How it can completely change someone's personality, or something will happen to their brain and entire parts of their life just disappear. In memories, and that's a consciousness is a weird thing.
yeah, and I don't even want to pretend to understand consciousness. In fact, part of what I am advocating for is epistemic humility, recognizing where we don't know. And consciousness is one of those areas.
Kind of in line with what you've said, I've heard you say is, I agree with you that the apologetics world could stand to be a little more humble about some of their assertions too, because I do agree that most of the material coming out of apologetics it's preaching to the choir. It's for believers to bolster our faith. It's far from being a definitive proof of anything. I do think there's plenty of evidence. There's plenty of, like you say, good arguments that people can go back and forth on and discuss, and smart people can have positions on. But I do think that, on our side, we could stand to maybe be a little more humble about what we don't know as well, and freely admit that, we're taking a lot of this on faith too. I mean, childlike faith, So if I can jump off of that really quick. Yeah.
I will be the first person to tell you, if you tell me that it is faith alone, I will say, I can't follow you there, but I respect that. If you say, here's my evidence, then the full intellectual, philosophical, scientific world comes to bear on that evidence.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm fine with, you have a subjective experience of God. I know what that's like. I know how convincing that is.
Yeah.
I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson who said that experience trumps arguments or evidence, right? Experience,
for a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is very hard to get outside of that. I want to address really what you're asking about. Why was apologetics a factor in my deconversion? Way before I was even having, conscious doubts, I would occasionally, read an apologetic work. My favorite at the time was Privileged Planet. Because it sounded real sciencey.
Right? Yeah.
I'm a kind of a pop science geek. I don't pretend to know or understand it all, but that really spoke to me.
Yeah. Me too. I like that. I like that kind of stuff at the surface level, like pop science. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And then I got my hands on a intelligent design book. And I have to say up front that I never really had a reason to doubt evolution.
Mm-hmm.
So that was never a part of my particular faith.
Mm-hmm.
So I was not a young earth creationist. I was more of the Stephen Jay Gould, the non-overlapping magisteria, right? Science does this, faith does this, and those two things are different. And so, in fact, what I came to recognize was the level of cognitive dissonance that it took to keep those things separate.
Yeah.
But back to the apologetics just for a second. So when I read this intelligent design book, I found that I was just horrified at. Now, keep in mind, I'm a full-blown believer at this time.
Yeah.
No doubts about God, right?
Yeah.
But I was horrified at how bad the argumentation was and how there was no evidence. It was purely of this just supports my perspective.
Yeah.
And so let's fast forward, in the last few years, and then particularly after the fact. So after the deconversion, I went back and looked and read, have I missed something? Is there something that, some compelling piece of evidence that I have missed?
Yeah.
And all I can tell you, Joel, is that the apologetic arguments have fatal flaws. They have horizon lines where it falls off and it takes faith to accept it.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think no matter how you approach it or what your argument is, you will always reach a point where there's going to be a leap. There has to be a leap of faith. There's intellect will never take you all the way there,
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So let me spin this back around. What is it that you find most compelling? Why are you a believer? And if that is the resurrection, what do you find convincing about the resurrection?
Yeah. So maybe I can answer this by kind of telling my story a little bit, because your podcast forced me to think about, why the heck do I still believe this stuff, And so I thought through. So my background, like I said, fundamentalist background. I was homeschooled. With a curriculum from a guy named Bill Gothard called ATI, or Advanced Training Institute. It's now classified as a cult.
Right.
and he was later outed as a perv and doing some bad stuff. So that's my background. Young Earth creationists. Ken Ham used to come and speak at our church. We were at the Creation Museum, when it first opened. I mean, the whole works. I used to go to, as a part of my homeschool curriculum during the summer, I would go to the local arboretum and take these nature classes. And the teacher there was an evolutionist. And I would always bring, all my Ken Ham books and, Chick tracts is, I mean, right. I'm a walking fundamentalist cliche. I debate him on evolution and young Earth creationism and all this stuff. And the world that I grew up in, a lot of abuse, a lot of it's a male dominated world where a lot of the churches are centered on the strong personality of the pastor, and he kind of makes the rules. Really ugly stuff. And I think that I was teetering when I was 19. I had spent my freshman year at a fundamentalist Christian college, not done very well there. And I was kind of deciding which direction I wanted to go with my life, teetering on my faith a little bit. And I joined the military, became a Marine Corps infantryman. Within a year, I was in Fallujah. Just boom, sheltered kid, homeschooled, fundamentalist. And then I'm taken out of the States, out of my little Christian bubble. And I spent a year in Iraq. As far as I knew, the only Christian in my platoon. We were on patrol every Sunday, so no access to church and services and things like that. I had a little Bible in my flak jacket that I kept with me, and I read when I could. And I think going back to kind of answer your question about what compels me about Christianity, I think the first thing was that, and this is experiential, this is an experience I'm describing. So it's, obviously not going to hold for everyone, but I was taken out of a Christian world, opposite side of the planet, and I opened my Bible and I read the words of Jesus in the gospel, and the words of Jesus really drew me in. There was something about that man that just seemed otherworldly and amazing to me. And I think that's when I started to kind of separate, what C.S. Lewis would call mere Christianity from all the ugly trappings that Christian culture kind of builds around it.
Sure.
And so I think that was the first step of my journey. And when people ask, that's usually what I tell them is that was the year of my true conversion, is when it was just simply reading through the Gospels, reading the words of Jesus. I came back, went to a state college after my career in the Marine Corps, and that's when I got more into the apologetics stuff and the reasons to believe, the reasons for my faith.
Mm-hmm.
But again, all that stuff it's all arguments. None of it's completely conclusive, and there's still an element of childlike faith involved with all of that. And so,
can I just say that's honest?
Yeah, yeah, no,
right. So you would be amazed, though, at how few Christians will just state it out like that.
Well, I don't know, man. I really appreciate what the Scripture says that He uses the weak and foolish things of this world. I am the quintessential weak and foolish, and there's no need for me to pretend that I have answers and that I have conclusively figured all of this out. It is a very childlike faith. It really is, and I think the next crisis I had was when I had a Calvinist stage. So
right. Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Didn't we all?
Oh, right. It's like adolescence. I started reading.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'll just say that I really think that both fundamentalism, however you want to define that, and Calvinism, in many ways, are the logical conclusion. You know what I mean? If you are a dedicated Christian, you really believe that this is the truth, the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah.
It's inexorably headed towards one of those two things or both at the same time.
Oh, that's the thing. In one sense, I agree with you, because Calvinism is very logical. It takes all of the words of Scripture, and it's like, okay, we have what Scripture says, and we're going to lay it all out logically, and this is how God works, and it's all here. It's like a mathematical formula. We have it all figured out. But then, but then you think about, it seems like we have free will. Yes, God is sovereign, but I feel like I have free will. The big struggle I had was, for one, all of the atrocities of the Old Testament, the wiping out entire nations, and then the question I think a lot of people have, that why would God create a human being and before the foundations of the earth predestine that human being to have his heart hardened to Him and be a vessel of His wrath for all eternity? That sounds horrifying to me.
Yeah, outside of Calvinism, if you're not a Calvinist, that is horrifying.
Yeah.
Yes.
and I don't understand a Christian who can stand up and say, oh, that's just, that's how God is, you just accept it. I think we have to admit that that's a little hard to swallow. And it was hard for me to swallow. And I kind of went through this crisis of, it's the classic philosophy 101. If God is all powerful and all good, how can an all powerful God allow evil? And, the answer I arrived to, it's not really an answer. It's, for one, I think as far as, God's sovereignty and man's free will goes, they are two things that don't seem to be able to exist at the same time, yet they do. And it's a mystery. And I have no idea how it works. And I just accept that. That's really it. Yeah.
So again, that's very honest. And I say quite often that the problem of evil or problem of suffering is a real problem.
Yeah.
And my critique, both of my former self and of Christianity in general, is that Christians tend to pick their favorite theodicy, their favorite answer to that.
Yeah.
And do exactly what you just did and say, yeah, it's a mystery.
Yeah.
and then never think about it again.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess my only challenge to you, Joel, is to say it's a real problem. Spend more time wrestling with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I'll always at some level wrestle with it. So I guess there are a few consolations that I have. And the first one is that, I believe that Jesus came to earth as a man. He lived a life of poverty and extreme suffering. So God does allow evil, but He entered into that evil and suffering and experienced it alongside us. The second consolation, if you will, I guess, is that I think being a father has helped me with this too. Since we are finite, mortal beings living in time and space, we cannot even begin to comprehend what a timeless, spaceless, eternal, all-knowing, all-powerful being is doing in the grand scheme of things. And, if you compare it to, when my daughter is about to stick a fork in a light socket and I run up to her really quick and I swat the fork out of her hand and she cries, in her little 1-year-old mind, she thinks that I've just rushed in for no reason and caused her great pain, when really I've saved her life. And I guess that's kind of how I look at a lot of the seeming injustices and evil that I see in this world, that I don't understand it, but I trust a God who is doing something that maybe I could never comprehend in this life, and someday I will. And I know that's a big that's a big leap of faith.
Yeah. So my response is just to say that I think, so back to my analogy of the big cathedral, and it's on these pillars. One of those pillars is that an all-powerful, all-knowing, loving God exists. Mm-hmm. And if you presuppose that God exists, anything is possible.
Yeah.
You can refer back to that to explain anything, including the problem of evil. And you have done so neatly there. If you are, however, asking the question, do I have evidence to believe that God exists? I really can't make reference to the mystery of God's greatness and his ineffableness, right?
Yeah. I think the moral argument, at least for me, is very compelling. I think if put aside Christianity for a minute, if you're just looking at does some sort of a God exist or not, I think that in my mind, and maybe you can educate me on this, in my mind, the only honest and logical way to look at the world in which God does not exist is nihilism. And obviously, that's no way to live. And I'm not saying that, atheists should live as nihilists, but it seems to be the only worldview that is consistent with a godless world. So I think that gets me to the starting point of, I guess, at least believing in some sort of a presupposing, if you will, that there's a God, Okay.
Can I answer the implied question in there?
Yeah.
Of how I kind of come to a sense of morality or purpose?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. We're going to use the word nihilism the way that you mean it.
Okay.
It turns out that I think that Nietzsche is very misunderstood, and that I think the basic claim that Nietzsche is making and the concept of nihilism is that there is no inherent meaning or truth in the universe, right? It is all matter and motion, that kind of thing. He isn't making any claim deeper than that.
Yes.
He's not saying that you should be hopeless and
exactly.
He's saying that is a natural response to that information.
Right.
But anyway, but the way that the church often uses it is a nihilism as a hopelessness, a not having any moral direction, not having a sense of purpose. Or
not at all.
How do you mean it? You tell me how.
Yeah,
you mean
I think I mean it in the I guess the Nietzschean sense that there's no basis for claiming any inherent objective meaning.
Okay, great.
To the universe.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because atheists, and you know as well as I do, there are atheists who live more moral and decent and hopeful and graceful lives than a lot of Christians I know. So it's obviously not believing in God isn't a requirement for living a life of meaning. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like that meaning it has to be an essential element of the universe. It can't just be something that we create in ourselves, or that evolved as humans evolved, or that we assign to things. Otherwise that creates too many problems for me. Kind of the idea of, if torturing a baby for your own pleasure is wrong, even if the entire world tortures babies and everyone thinks it's okay, and all the laws that say it's okay, and there's not one single person on earth that believes it's wrong, it's still wrong. I think that again, going back to that leap of faith, there's nothing I can say to prove that. It's just, I cannot come to the conclusion that, torturing a baby is not objectively inherently wrong, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So if you can give me a little bit of time to try to respond to a few things here. So one of them is about, do I have to be a nihilist? And if I am a nihilist, how do I live in the world? And then the other is about objective morality, and objective in the biggest sense of the word.
Yeah.
And I'm going to step back and try to describe it as a whole. I think there's this idea of the Copernican principle, which basically was, we thought we were the center of the universe. We thought the Earth was the center of the universe. And we discovered that no, we're heliocentric, and that sun is going around a galaxy, and that galaxy is out in the middle of the cosmos. And that there's nothing special about the location that we're at.
Yeah.
It's very important that we learn the lesson of that we can be human-centric, we can be Earth-centric, we can be male-centric, we can be, that we need some humility.
Yeah.
And that is a lesson we need to have. However, the flip side of that coin is that you can go into just a dejected, why should I go on living? The question of why should I live is a serious question. That's kind of what existentialism was, right? That was
one of my questions for you is, from your deconversion, did you go through a nihilistic phase, or did you struggle with that for a while, or?
No, and let me continue with.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. It's all right. The flip side of the equation is that we always have to jumpstart something, right? We have to have an axiom.
Yeah.
So if things are valuable because they are rare, as far as we know, with scientific knowledge, we are the only conscious beings in the universe. We may only be the only life in the universe. Now, I think there's, statistical probability that is not the case, but as far as we know and can prove, which makes us as human beings the most rare commodity in the universe. We are conscious beings who can not only just to be conscious ourselves, but to interact with each other. My argument, and where I derive my sense of purpose, my sense of meaning, is that human beings are meaning makers. There may not be inherent meaning in the universe, but we do make meaning. And that this connection, even between you and I right now, this is meaningful.
Yeah.
I think our chat on the phone a week ago and this conversation is going to affect us for some time. Right?
Yeah.
And that's meaningful.
That's a good argument. It is, because I come kind of from the presuppositional, well, human beings are valuable because we're made in the image of God. And again, kind of the presupposing thing. That's a good, I guess, if you were to present an alternative, that sounds like a decent alternative. As I'm thinking about it right now, I've never heard that approach before.
Yeah. So when I say that I am a humanist, the first thing I want to say when I'm talking to a Christian is that does not mean that I worship humans or that I deny that humans are eminently fallible.
Right. Yeah.
Human beings are capable of great evil and great good.
Yeah.
And we cannot say, we can't deny either of those facts. Yeah. I am not, and my point being that I don't believe in utopias or dystopias. People are people.
Yeah.
What I'm asserting, and I admit that I'm asserting, is that people are more important than ideologies. And that where we go wrong is when ideologies, whether they're political, economic, theological, when those start to override and hurt human beings, they are wrong on that level. And so that is where I base my morality. Now, I will admit, because I have no truly objective framework to refer to, that there is some relativism that is inherent in there.
Sure.
And I'll personally own that. And it makes me uncomfortable. I know many atheists who are moral realists. I wish I could go there. I can't personally.
Moral realist, like would Sam Harris be a moral realist or?
Yes,
Okay.
he would say from he would say from a that suffering is bad, and so anything that diminishes suffering and enhances human thriving is good. But his conversation with Sean Carroll was really enlightening, in which Sean was very kind, and he was saying to Sam, "Listen, you're smuggling in that suffering is bad."
Yeah.
Right. And so now, again, I don't want to even compare myself to either of those guys. Those guys are geniuses. But my point is that I want to face reality as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't find a source for an objectivity in the way that you describe it. Right. So that the interesting artifact of that is that when you go through the deconversion process, one of the first things that is admittedly terrifying is the sudden realization that I am responsible for the choices that I make. I have no one to say they told me to do this.
Yeah.
I am 100% responsible for my moral decisions.
You're not part of a system anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, and I'll make, my argument that I think humanism, as say expressed by the UN Declaration of Human Rights, is a good starting point. And I can argue that. You can disagree with me.
Yeah, sure.
What I acknowledge off the bat is that all moral philosophies are incomplete or limited in some way. And I include in that religious ones. And so we have to have some humility when we are comparing moral philosophies.
It's so true. There, no matter what you're looking at, there's going to be a couple gaps here and there.
Right.
And we happen to fill our gaps with God.
Right.
Some people call that God of the gaps, but it works for a lot of us, I think that's when it all comes down to it, that's where I end up, is believing in God is the only way that me personally, that I can make sense of the world. Everything else is going to fall short in some way, shape or form. And I acknowledge I'm filling those gaps with a timeless, spaceless, all powerful, all knowing, loving being, personal being. But yeah, that's where I am, Yeah.
And Joel, you'd be surprised for me to say this, but I respect that. I believe in secularism, which is the freedom of religion and the freedom from religion. Right?
Yeah.
I am not one of those atheists who says, let's eradicate all religion. First of all, I think that's not possible. Second of all, I think it is counter to what we want as atheists. We want the freedom from part. Yeah. And in order to do that, we have to respect that many people choose to believe and have a belief, whether they choose to or not. And it would be totalitarian to do otherwise, right? So I believe in freedom. In fact, I say this a lot too: the separation of church and state is good for the state and it's good for the church. And I think, I don't want to get into politics too much, but I think when the church gains political power, that's not good for anyone.
No way. Yeah. That's one of the ideas I appreciate that came. I wish I could remember who it was. One of the founders said something along the lines of, if Christianity is true, then it should be able to stand or fall on its own without the support of any power or any state. And I completely agree with that. I mean, if it's not true, then it should be allowed to die. If it is true, then it should not need the power of the state to survive. And so where do you think that comes from? So I was listening to an interview, I think it was Joe Rogan and Richard Dawkins a few weeks ago. And Richard Dawkins, I guess, he's more of kind of an evangelist for the atheist worldview, and he's very adamant about trying to spread that. He recently wrote that children's book, and he talked about how religion is growing in some parts of the world, and he found that very discouraging. I guess where do you fall in that? If you're being honest, would you like to see secularism grow as a worldview? Do you think that the world would be better off if more people thought like that?
Okay, I think I have a nuanced answer to that. So let me try to expand on it. A couple of things there. One, I've written about why I'm not an anti-theist. The term that I like to use to differentiate just your general run-of-the-mill atheist who doesn't believe versus someone who is kind of aggressively trying to actively stop people from believing is this idea of anti-theist. And I would put Dawkins in that role. Having said that, I do believe that net, religion has done quite a bit of harm, and it is at least debatable as to whether or not religion has done more good or more harm.
Yeah, sure. I agree.
The fact that it is debatable at all tells me something. And I want to be clear here.
Yeah.
What I said earlier, people are fallible. And it is the people within those religions.
I think that any kind of power structure,
sure, whether
it's religion, government, anytime you put fallible human beings in power, it seems like there's a lot of harm typically done. Right.
Yeah. So the other end of that spectrum is this. I've also written about how I've handled my friends and family. And a lot of atheists, and I warn people when they're early in their deconversion. Right when you go through deconversion, you have read all those books, man. You've had Dawkins, and you want to be a Hitchens. You want to say the zinger. You want to just crush people in debate. And
just waiting for Thanksgiving to come.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Uncle Joe's going down. And you're all this emotion of just the. It's just this recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, new Christians do the same thing.
Sure. Yeah. No,
anytime
true.
You kind of wake up to a new ideology, it's like, oh, everyone has to know about this,
Exactly. So what I've written about is that, and I don't, it's hard for me to talk about it without being somewhat negative.
It's okay. It's fine.
But like, if belief in God is a support system, I'm trying to put as little value statement into that as possible, but it is supportive.
Yeah.
Taking someone who is relying on that supportiveness and kicking it out from underneath them is not loving that person. And my argument is this, that a very large number of people are going to be believers, and that's going to be meaningful and useful for them. It's going to give them a sense of purpose. I argue often that what religion is good at is community. And one of the things that's the hardest to recover is finding community outside of the church. That's very difficult.
Well, that's what makes what you're doing so special and so cool. I like that you're working to kind of grow and strengthen community in your sphere. I think that's really neat. And what you just said about religion being a support system or even a crutch, I don't think is negative at all.
Okay, good. Okay.
I will freely admit to you that religion is my crutch.
Okay. All right, great.
I mean, I would have said the same. I would describe myself as a poor beggar who desperately needs the teachings of Jesus and the support system of religion and my church to function.
Okay.
And hats off to anyone who doesn't need that, but I do.
Okay. Yeah. Again, thank you. I appreciate it. That's honest. I get that. I think I would have expressed it quite similarly. For myself when I was a believer. So to wrap up that last thought was just that the idea of going and removing that crutch, whether I think it's a crutch or not, isn't acting in kindness and love, and it's inhumane is the argument that I'm making. And so whereas I think the abuses of religion need to be called out. So I'm not saying that we don't think that there are many things that need to be called out.
Absolutely.
And including the mixing with politics. And so I think that that's necessary. But on the individual level, I am just not interested in trying to remove someone's faith because when they enjoy that, and when they that would be totalitarian. So that's just not me.
Well, sometimes there's a you might be familiar with there's a Christian apologist named Greg Koukl, I think, and he talks about putting a pebble in someone's shoe. And and whether you're atheist or Christian, sometimes that's all you need to do. You don't need to push hard. Just put a pebble in their shoe. Give them something to think about. It's always good to give someone to think about and challenge them if they're open to it. You don't want to push it on them. But do you think that if secularism could get that community aspect down, do you think that would do away with a lot of need for traditional religion in the church. And I guess to tag onto that, do you see that happening, or I guess is the secular community growing in that aspect?
So I'm going to answer the last one first. No, I don't think that the secular community is doing particularly well at building community. It's a super big challenge. I've seen a few attempts.
Yeah.
Things like Sunday Assembly, and they thrive for a while and then they kind of die off. And two, if the secular community could get that down, then yes, I think a huge part, and I think if you really think about this, you might agree, a huge part of what you get from being a Christian is that built-in community. It's
absolutely,
man, I'm in the hospital and somebody shows up, with flowers, or my car broke down and somebody gives you, a new tire. People having the framework within to be good to one another.
Absolutely.
That is the beautiful thing about religion. And what I have come to learn is this is an old question. We think, this is all brand new, and the new atheists, and what's going to happen. Cicero was asking these questions. Lucretius was asking these questions. The Socrates was asking the question of
that's interesting.
What happens if we remove religion? What does society do? So where I would probably agree with you is that if tomorrow night, religion goes away, that would be a net bad thing, because that includes that community, that includes the shared values, that includes a shared sense of direction. So we need the replacements for those. And I will be the first to admit that the secular community doesn't have those yet. And the last thought on this is this. The problem is that we are in an exponential curve on the information access line, right?
We don't seem to be getting any smarter, though. That's the only
that may be true, yeah. But what I'm saying, what I would conjecture is that the internet was a part of, I had access to, in the confines and the safety of my own home, to explore ideas that if the internet didn't exist, I would never have run across.
Oh yeah.
And it challenged me to really think hard about why the same question you've been posing all podcasts. Why do you still believe? I spent hours thinking about this, and hours on the other side thinking about why I don't and why I did. And this is the question. But what I'm conjecturing is that the mere fact that all of these things exist, that deconverts are out now telling their stories, is going to have an impact. There is going to be an erosion of religious affiliation, at least in the short term.
There already is. Yeah. I mean,
So I would predict that overall secularization will occur, and more fundamentalism will rise up.
So it'll start to polarize more, like you'll get the hardliner.
Yeah, exactly. And I imagine that will, more and more tension in world geopolitics as well.
Yeah. So. Fun times ahead.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, that's why it's so, what you're doing, I'm sorry, I keep going back to this. What you're doing is so important, is being that voice of grace. That's the biggest thing that kind of binds us together here is the sense that we want to love our neighbor and show grace to people. And hopefully that value wins out as the world starts to polarize, Yeah.
One thing that I did recognize was that the reason I was so focused on grace as a Christian is that, and I wouldn't have used the term at the time, but that I was a religious humanist. It turns out that there's a huge tradition of religious humanism. Within that framework, particularly at the turn of the 20th century, the people who were, advocating for prison reform, advocating for immigrants, those were Christians.
Yeah. And
they were doing so based on humanist principles, right? You haven't asked this question, but I'm going to answer it anyway.
Yeah.
I think from one of your podcasts, this is why I bring it up.
Yeah.
One thing that I hear often is that Christians will say, well, humanism or secularism borrows its morality from Christianity.
Yeah. I wasn't going to bring that up, but yeah, that is one thing I do say a lot, that we kind of we live in a culture that's very Judeo-Christian inspired or built upon a Judeo-Christian foundation. And my sense is that I feel like a lot of us take that for granted and make the mistake of assuming that those values are just inherent to humanity, and that's a mistake. But that's my position on it. I would like to hear what you think about that, because I've always kind of wondered about that.
So I think this is great. A great question. Let me just say that the book that's probably had the most profound impact on me after deconversion was not Dawkins. It wasn't Hitchens. It was a book by Jennifer Michael Hecht called Doubt: A History.
Okay.
And what she looked at was...
I'm writing this down. I'm going to check it out.
Yeah, no, it's really good, and I recommend for believers as well. It's very, very useful.
Okay.
She goes back basically 2,500 years. So she's looking in, Old Testament times. She's looking at various cultures, Buddhism, Confucianism, Islam, basically looking at throughout all of human history, there have been believers and there have been doubters. And the brilliant thing that Jennifer Michael Hecht does is she points out that sometimes we only get the negative impression of the secular argument. What she means by that is, we have the record of the believers. They wrote it down. And we have their response to an argument that the doubters were making. And we can only infer the doubter's perspective it's written down. So this is the genius of this book. She's going through many different cultures, many different... and the thing that I found deeply meaningful for me personally was that these questions that we've been wrestling with all podcast long are old. These questions have been asked by human beings from the beginning of recorded history.
Yeah.
And my argument is this: humanism under a different name, and what I just mean by humanism is caring about the rights of human beings.
Yeah.
It predates Judeo-Christianity, right? It was in the air. It was a part of all those different cultures. And if you took a Venn diagram of all religions, right? So imagine a flower shape thing, punch out the supernatural bits. What you have in the middle left is humanism.
Yep.
And that's what I'm arguing for. I'm saying that the idea of caring for other human beings, I would say, is evolved, right? And the more we are able to express that and enact it, I don't care what you believe about the supernatural, right? If you
it's always been there, and we have just found different ways of describing it and trying to understand it through different religions and beliefs. And
let me put the rubber to meet in the road here. Jesus is probably one of the most profound humanists I've ever read, right? He was expressing the value of human beings. Now, obviously, from both his perspective and yours, that value was derived from a theistic God. I'm saying that we can just start there. We can just assert, that human beings have value and go from there. And that is what humanism is. That's
good. That's the best explanation I've probably ever heard about what that is. And that we can edit this out because I don't want to debate you, but, but you know what the Christian answer to that would be is, and you've probably heard this a million times before already, but the Christian would say, well, that is because that God's law is written on our hearts. It's been embedded in humanity since, it's the story that's always been there, and and then we discovered it. We discovered the truth that already existed, written on our hearts. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Again, hearkening back to God, but it's essentially the same idea. You know what I mean? That core has always been there. And different people and different cultures have found different ways of trying to understand and express it.
So I agree that would be the response. And my only response to that is, so you assert.
Yeah, exactly. It's just an assertion. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and this is what I was saying earlier, right? If you take a certain set of presuppositions or assumptions or what have you, it makes perfect sense to be a believer. I'm just saying I can't follow you there.
That's fair, man. I can respect that. I like this conversation that we're having. It's really making a lot clearer for me what the real differences are. I appreciate not talking past each other. It seems like, I feel like I understand it.
Yeah.
What would convince you otherwise or change your mind? Like, would it have to be like a piece of like hard evidence of the resurrection, or like God descending from the sky and showing himself to the world, or something like that?
Yes. So what I have a problem with referring to the Bible as the evidence for the resurrection is, if I use that standard for historical references to miracles, then Islam is correct and Mormonism is correct. Right.
Circular.
So if you could give me a historical standard such that it only left Christianity, that would begin the process, right? I'm not saying that that's all it would take. On the sense of, personal experience, I mean, yes, it turns out that I was, from a Pentecostal background, a charismatic background, and I found myself in these services where there was a lot of emotion and there was a lot of talk about healing.
Yeah.
But no actual healings.
no arms growing back.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, it seems to me that it would be trivial for God to reveal himself. Trivial. And to expand on this further, Sean Carroll talks about, if you have a model for reality, present that model, make some predictions, and see if they come true. And my argument is this: if your model is that a all-powerful, theistic, loving, all knowledgeable God exists, what would you expect the world to look like? And so one of my questions to you is, if you happen to be mistaken, how would the world look different?
If I was mistaken, I think that I would expect the human world, to look a lot more like the animal world. I don't think that we would have constructed all of these systems of religion and trying to delve into these ideas and meaning for all of human history if there wasn't something else going on.
Okay.
I think that's how I would expect the world to look if I am wrong, if there is no God. I would expect it to look like, a pride of lions in the savannah, or a herd of monkeys in the jungle, or a flock of birds. Human beings would just be one of the mass of life forms. But there's, whether it's just because we're more highly evolved and this consciousness has developed through millions and millions of years of natural selection and mutation, or God created us in his image, there seems to be something undeniable about human beings that, to me, points to something more, a God.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask you some questions just to see if we can poke some intuitions? Just to see? Okay. Do you think that ghosts exist?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't know.
Okay. You are aware that many, many, many human beings believe that ghosts exist. Yes. Okay.
No, I don't think ghosts exist.
Okay. Yeah. This is really kind of yes and no questions for just a second.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Do you think practitioners of voodoo can affect other people?
Yes.
You do?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. That's a great answer. Okay. When a person of a different faith, let's say a Hindu praying to Vishnu, prays, and from their perspective, they get an answer to prayer, what has happened?
I have no idea.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I'm being honest. It's going to be hard to pin me down because, well, okay, I'll let you finish your line of questioning. And
sure. I want to just keep going with this a little bit.
Yep.
So would you say that all religions are attempts to understand the same God, some better than others?
I would say most of them, yes, with the exception, with some exceptions like Scientology that are just obvious for what they are. Yes, I would say most religions are attempts to understand the truth of some God out there. Yeah.
Okay. So I love that you brought up Scientology, because Scientology was also one of the things that that sparked for me some of, being able to see myself from outside of the Christian perspective. And that is, I had the exact same reaction. Scientology is insane.
Yeah.
We literally know that L. Ron Hubbard was a science fiction writer.
Isn't that insane? And people still believe. It's amazing.
He was literally quoted as saying, I think I'll start a religion. So my question along those lines is, do you doubt that a dedicated Scientologist really believes what they say they believe?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you doubt that a Mormon who says that Joseph Smith found the Angel Moroni's, I forget all the details, but gold tablets. Do you believe that they believe that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think they're wrong?
I think they are wrong in their perception of what happened. I won't deny that they might be observing something real.
Okay.
Something that may be happening, whether it be, physiological, something in the spirit world, because, obviously I'm a Christian. I do believe the spirit world exists.
Okay.
I think that they may be observing or experiencing something real, but have failed to describe it or understand it properly.
Okay.
If that makes sense. I really liked the story, and forgive me, I can't place his name. He helped write the Still Unbelievable book. You interviewed him.
Yeah, either Matthew Taylor or Andrew Knight.
Yeah, he talked about his experience of sleep paralysis, and what he felt was a demonic attack, and then later realizing, oh well, that's just an actual phenomenon that happens to people, and it kind of helped snap him out of some of his belief. So I guess that's how I would describe it. Is I do agree with you that people can experience things and can truly believe in what they think they're experiencing, whether or not they're correct.
Okay, great. So where I'm going with all this is this, that I came to understand that the Muslim who is praying to Allah, the Hindu who is praying to any number of gods, the Scientologist who's not praying but doing the interviewing, that kind of thing, the Mormon who thinks that Joseph Smith did, they all believe with the same level of intensity and personal conviction that I believed in Christianity.
Yeah. And that I believe. Yeah.
And that you believe. And when I stepped back and looked at that, because I thought as a Christian that those things were obviously not true. Mm-hmm. Maybe you don't, but I did. And I
do. I'm with you there. I would agree that all the other religions, all the other gods,
right.
except for mine. Yeah,
exactly. Precisely. So then you have to ask yourself, if they were looking at you, would they think that you were correct, or would they think that you were mistaken? Yeah.
That's an excellent point. The other way I hear it stated a lot is that, okay, you're a Christian. Well, you're also an atheist. You're atheist regarding all of the other gods out there, except for your God.
Yeah.
You
spend zero psychic energy worrying about Zeus and obeying his voice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Take this or leave it. I heard an explanation, not an explanation, but just a way of understanding that idea or that argument that at least helped me or resonated with me. And that was the idea that, if there's a criminal case and you're putting a criminal on the stand and, the lawyers are presenting the evidence to the jury, what if the lawyer for the defense were to get up before the jury and say, well, jury, you believe all of the other 7 billion people in the world are innocent. So what's just one more? Just you already have cleared the rest of humanity. Clear one more. What's the difference? And that's like,
let me steel man what you're saying. What you're saying that it is, you cannot assume that Christianity is wrong,
right?
Because if it were the one true religion, and it just so happens that all the others are false, you would still be wrong to not follow it. So then my question then is, if you happened to not be American and you grew up in Saudi Arabia,
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any doubt that you would not be a Christian, that you would be some flavor of Islam?
Yeah, I would probably be Islamic,
Okay. And you would be mistaken, yes?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That's another thing that we Christians struggle with too is, what do you do with the folks that you believe are wrong, that have been raised their entire life to believe that thing, they believe it fervently, and to take Saudi Arabia for an example, there's not a huge Christian presence in Saudi Arabia,
right?
Evangelizing, so they don't hear my version of it. Do I really think that those people are destined to hell for all eternity because they don't believe my version of it? That's a tough. Yeah, that's another biggie for Christians.
Yeah. I'll take it one step further. Again, as far as we know,
mm-hmm.
humanity's been around for a few 100,000 years, if you believe in evolution.
Mm-hmm.
Recorded history, 10,000 years or so, which
mm-hmm.
predates Judaism and
mm-hmm.
Christianity.
Yeah.
So for every human being who lived prior to let's just say the Old Testament,
mm-hmm.
Who may have worshipped other gods, they were all wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think I guess I can speculate,
Sure, go ahead.
And this is worthless because it's just some dude in Ohio speculating. But, I suspect that all of the folks before, God revealed himself the way Christians believe God revealed himself through the Jewish people and through the scriptures, I guess I would just assume and hope that God revealed himself in some other way to those people that I don't know.
Sure.
I think, some things that I've read coming out of the Muslim world, for example, there's some weird things that have happened where, new converts to Christianity who were converted while living in like ISIS controlled territory, describing things like dreams where Jesus appeared to them and they didn't even know who it was. And that kind of started them on this journey that led them to believing in Jesus. I guess I just suppose that whether it's people 10,000 years ago or people in another country, Asia, Middle East, and again, this is just me asserting,
Sure.
I'll admit, but I'm kind of placing faith in the idea that a just and merciful God is going to give everyone a chance in some way to know and understand who he is, whether they have access to the Bible or Christianity or not. There's a biography I read when I was little of a guy named Samuel Morris, who his birth name was Kabu, and he was the chief's son in an African tribe. He was captured by a neighboring tribe, and they tortured him for years and had put him up for ransom until the other tribe could pay the chief back. And he describes a light and a voice that led him out of that village and into the jungle to a missionary compound in Africa. And he eventually became a missionary to the U.S. I think this was in the 1800s. But yeah, just things like that. It's like I suppose I just believe that God is going to reach people one way or another. And I know that's probably not a satisfactory answer for a rational person, but
fair enough. And I don't think we've tread into new territory on this particular line of questioning. So let's go ahead and drop that. I've got about 15 minutes left. I want to definitely give you some opportunities to ask some questions, and then I've got kind of a wrap-up question that will.
Okay. Can I ask two more?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
Or maybe I'll just throw them out there and you can kind of pick which one you'd like to spend more time on.
I think we have enough time for two more.
Okay. As far as your family goes, how is that? How's that dynamic? How are you guys doing? It's really cool and inspiring to me to hear you say that you're still madly in love with her, and it seems like your marriage is going well, and your kids are doing great. I guess, can you tell me a little bit about that whole experience and what that's been like?
Yeah, and this is by far the hardest thing, Joel. I can tell you that it's a process. You change over a long period of time, and you can become aware of it. It was Matthew Taylor who actually mentioned that, where it happened suddenly, but the suddenly describes my awareness, not the process. So I had this sudden moment of, I don't believe anymore. And then I spent about 2 months sweating bullets. Like, how am I going to tell my wife? And my greatest fear was that I would lose her.
Yeah.
And then the night that I told her, I mean, I was literally shaking. Right. It was terrifying. And she has been as good as is possible to be, right? I know that I stuck the knife in and twisted it. I changed the rules that we had agreed on, as it were, in our marriage. What I have tried to do is to focus on that my love for her has nothing to do with what she believes. I, in fact, love her in a way that encompasses her spirituality. I often try to engage her in spiritual conversation, not to dissuade her, but to encourage her, right? I care about her spiritual, however you define that word, well-being. I would be lying if I said that it is a smooth road, right? We have flare-ups, we have arguments, we have moments where that is underneath the surface of some other petty argument.
I know that.
I try, much like my approach here, to be as honest as I can be and vulnerable as I can be with her. And that sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't. If you had her on, she might have a drastically different perspective. It happens that by the time they hear your episode, I will have dropped an episode of a believing spouse of a atheist who's a blogger and a podcaster. And we go over some of that. Like, what was it like for her when her husband told her that he had deconverted? And
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that should be a good one. Yeah. So, but long story short, with my kids, my approach with my kids is I explicitly tell them this. I want to teach you how to think, not what to think.
That's great.
So I will support them, and I explicitly state this: whatever you believe, I will support you. I'll take you to church. I'll support you in everything that you do.
Wow.
Here are some ways that I think you should approach your decision making, but what you decide is up to you. So again, sometimes that works really well. Sometimes it doesn't. I think I'm a curiosity to some of my family, and other people try to pretend that part of me doesn't exist. I regularly hold hands and stand with people as they pray, and I think about how grateful I am for them and that I love them.
Do you feel like one thing I hear a lot from the ex-evangelicals is the kind of the dehumanization, or the dehumanizing feeling of being proselytized all the time, or being someone's project, so to speak.
Yeah.
Do you feel that ever, or do you get that sense that like people are like working on you, or like trying to get you back in the fold, or like?
So in my personal experience, that hasn't been the case. Now I know there are plenty of people where that is the case.
Yeah.
So interestingly for me, because I've got a bunch of friends from Bible college who are my dear friends, I still love them. Part of it is just, I'm old and we don't contact each other nearly as much as I would like. Right. And that's as much on me as it is on them. But as I've told people, there's often a silence of just, people don't really engage anymore. My best friend in the world, we chat probably twice a month. We go out for coffee and hang out, and we'll broach the subject and go on to politics and talk about work. And it's very comfortable with he and I. And that is based out of mutual respect. Again, I care about him. I care about his spiritual well-being. Right. And he knows that. And so we're able to, there's no threat. And I'm not trying to change I'm not trying to change his mind, and he's not trying to change mine. Having said all that, if someone were to engage me, because I like having discussions about the big questions.
I do too. I get a kick out of it.
I think that's something that you and I share very deeply. One of the things that I found the most difficult after Bible college was, even inside the church, I couldn't find people who wanted to have these deep discussions.
Uh-huh.
And I'm still that person. Right? I don't care what you believe. Let's talk about it. Let's hash it out.
That's cool, man. Well, maybe we got to start something, man. I'm feeling that too. It's hard to find those people that just want to sit down for 2 hours and, Plato's Socrates, the deep questions of the world, the universe. It's fun. I enjoy it.
I do too.
Yeah.
So my last question is not a gotcha. I'm legitimately curious.
Yeah. Please.
How you answer this for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You have described what I might call a deconstruction process. You went from IFB, very more literal believer, to a new position that ironically is closer to many of the ex-evangelicals we're talking about than to me. You don't share political viewpoints, but spiritually, right. I bet you guys are pretty close. Uh-huh. My question to you is this. How do you know that you are currently correct? And how did you judge that you were previously mistaken?
I think it is, I guess if you'll forgive me, I'll use another scripture here. And I can't remember the reference, but somewhere where in the Bible it says, by your fruits you will know them. Mm-hmm. I think that you have to judge people by their fruits or the way they live their lives, and the results of it rather than their ideology. And if their fruits are bad, then there's probably something wrong with their ideology. And I look at what comes out of that movement that I came out of, and it's not good. The fruit isn't good, and that's why I look at someone like you and please don't be offended by this. I think, gosh, am I sure this guy are you sure you're not still a Christian?
I'm positive.
I know. But you know what I mean? That I think that you have to judge people by their fruits and their love for their neighbor, and I think I think that's the biggest indicator to me that something was very wrong with that world. It wasn't anything like academic or like a logical argument that I found a fallacy in the way they analyzed theology or whatever. I mean, could the world be 6,000 years old, 7-day literal creation? I don't think so. But I think what is more important to me is living in the light of Christ and being his hands and feet. And just the words of Jesus in the gospel give so much clarity to that, I think. And that's what kind of blew away all of the nastiness that I grew up in. Is there's just kind of a fresh air clarity to what Jesus says. Jesus challenges you no matter whether you come from the right or the left, liberalism, fundamentalism. Jesus has something to say to all those people that's going to get under your skin a little bit, Yeah. And I think that's what I'm going with. It's just, the person of Jesus is such a compelling person to me. I just can't take my eyes off him.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Before we start to wrap up, Joel, how can people find your work? How can they find you online to send you hate mail? And
Yeah, I need hate mail and hate clicks. That's what I'm looking for. Thanks for letting me pitch. My website is thepettyprophet.com. So it's The Petty Prophet. I have a podcast. I do a little satire, some op-ed. It is from, the Christian worldview, but it's also from kind of a right-wing political bent. So be aware of that as you go in. I mean, no ill will, but I do enjoy engaging with leftists, progressives, and atheists more than my own tribe, because I know what my own tribe thinks. It's boring. I have several atheist friends. I have some really close gay friends, and just unbelieving friends that very consistently like to debate and engage me on the content that I put out there, and I really enjoy that. So if you're out there listening, check out The Petty Prophet. If you want to call me out on my BS, write me. And I'd love to have a dialogue with you. So
Very good. And I just want to say thank you for meeting me in an honesty contest. This went much better than I could have hoped for.
Well, thank you.
I really honestly think that, we did have a true sharing of perspectives, a true conversation. Yeah. I never felt like either of us was really, trying to upend the other person. And I really think that's the thing that will be valuable. The believers who listen to this are going to think you did fantastic, and the atheists think I'm going to do fantastic, and that's perfect.
Just you can make the title of this episode like, Graceful Atheist destroys ignorant Christian with facts and logic, or something like that.
I promise not to do that. So.
I appreciate it, man. I'm going to continue to listen to your podcast. I really appreciate what you're doing and enjoy it. And hey, man, I would love to have another talk like this with the recording going or not.
Yeah.
Anytime you want to talk and hang out, I'd love to do that. So thanks for letting me do it. I enjoyed myself.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm sure we will do some more.
Sounds good, man.
Final thoughts on the episode. I want to begin by thanking Joel for coming on the podcast and engaging in an honesty contest with me. Joel also did the editing of our conversation, which is a non-trivial amount of work, and I want to thank him very much for doing that. I'd also like to thank Joel for taking the initiative and reaching out in the first place. It was definitely a brave thing to do, to come onto the podcast, knowing that I was going to push at some of his beliefs, but he was more than willing to do so, and I appreciate him pushing me as well. I also appreciate that Joel was in fact not trolling me, that he did in fact want to have a conversation and truly listened to my answers. I am in no way thinking that I have changed his mind, nor has he changed mine. And in fact, to hear what Joel really thinks when he's talking to other believers, I highly recommend that you listen to The Petty Prophets, episode number 32 from January 16th. In that episode, Joel and his brothers talk about doubt. Joel makes reference to this podcast, and in some ways it's a response podcast to this one. So again, to give Joel the fullest ability to express himself, I suggest you go and listen to that podcast as well. There will be links in the show notes for that episode, as well as the Petty Prophet podcast itself. In this conversation with Joel, what I was hoping to accomplish was to have an example of a conversation between a believer and an atheist in which we show a modicum of respect towards one another and actually listen to each other and ask questions that we honestly wanted to know the answers to. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. My main thought for today is not about Joel and not about the podcast you've just heard. I've actually re-recorded this final thoughts a few times now, and I've decided to just respond to the zeitgeist of the moment, but I would like to make clear that this is not directed at Joel. Recently on the Unbelievable podcast, Justin Brierley had Glenn Scrivener and Matt Dillahunty. Now, where I don't always agree with prominent atheists like Matt Dillahunty, I think Matt did an excellent job of describing secular humanism and effectively defending it as a moral philosophy. And it's this that's at the top of my mind and what I want to respond to. I find it really interesting that Christians or believers spend so much time trying to invalidate atheist or secular humanists' justification for morality. They attack our reasoning for wanting to do good. And I just find this baffling. I appreciate that if they were to accept the secular humanist argument for morality, that this would somehow undermine the need to have a belief system like a Christian does. I understand that. However, my message to you, if you're a Christian, if you're a believer, if you're a Muslim, if you are a theist of any kind, is this. And so let me drop some Tony Campolo-style prophetic word on you here. If you're a Christian and you are more concerned about invalidating my secular justifications for caring about people, more than you actually care about caring for people, then you are not following your Christ very well. Suffice it to say that we disagree with one another's justifications. As I said at the top of the podcast, this is the given. But ultimately, this is what pluralism is. Because humanity does not agree on one set of moral ethics, we must come to the marketplace of ideas and be willing to hear from one another, to argue, to debate, to have our ideas challenged by one another, so that hopefully the best ideas come out on top. The problem is when you come to the marketplace of ideas with an ideology that is impervious to error correction, that cannot be changed. This is the problem. It is entirely possible to have a secular worldview and ideology that is impervious to error correction as well. So this has nothing to do with belief. The 21st century, the main skills that we will need to have are, one, the ability to correctly evaluate evidence, and number two, to be able to communicate ideas and correct for mistakes in our own personal ideologies. And without this, I am concerned for humanity's sake. So to wrap up, my secular grace thought of the week is this. Although it's a lot of fun to talk about metaethics and to argue and debate and to challenge one another, that's fun. I enjoy it. I love philosophy. Let's make sure, however, that we don't spend so much time arguing over metaethics that we forget to care about ethics themselves, and ultimately, for caring about one another. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Micaiah Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast's audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.